Welcome to Living Not So Fabulously, the podcast where we pull back the curtain on money stories from your favorite activists and allies, artists and tech gurus, and trailblazing leaders in the LGBTQ+ community. We are David
and John Ottenschneider,
your financial coaches and hosts.
Having experienced firsthand what it's like coming back from debt, we want to help you avoid our mistakes to build the life that you want.
So we all can live just a little bit more fabulously.
And now for the show.
Looking for a guy in finance, 6'5", blue eyes? Well, we may have found him. Welcome to Living Not So Fabulously. In today's episode, we're talking with Todds Sears. Todd is the founder and CEO of Outleadership, which is helping LGBTQ folks across the globe reach C and E suites in the corporate world.
Prior to Outleadership, Todd was the first LGBT financial advisor to create and develop a book of clients solely focused on the LGBT community, which ultimately managed over $2 billion in LGBT identified assets. Todd shares how open his family was with talking about money, and that's really the root of financial success for many people, which reminds me of our first FinCon. FinCon is a personal finance conference for money nerds to attend and rub heads together, right? And the first year we went, there were about 900 or so other content creators. And we realized that these creators were speaking to different niches. Mommy bloggers, Christian bloggers, military families, all different kind of communities, but nobody was speaking to our community, the LGBT community.
We knew this because we were the only ones walking around holding hands. And as a matter of fact, we went home from that conference and we started the Queer Money podcast, which we started in 2016. And that is also the reason why we started Living Not So Fabulously, to share with you more stories of LGBTQ folks and their money stories, just like we're going to share with Todd today.
So let's hear what he has to say.
Well, Todds Sears, welcome to Living Not So Fabulously.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
likewise.
Definitely.
Thanks for coming.
So we wanted to kick off the conversation with what John and I think is kind of a funny saying here that we've come up with, is this idea that there are two types of families. The families that talk about money, and there are the families that fight about money. And more often not, the ones that fight about money are that way because they don't talk about money. So what was your childhood experience like growing up with the conversation around finances, or if there even was one?
That's interesting. So there's not a Venn diagram of talking about money and fighting about money. I feel like one could lead to the other.
I'm sure there probably is some overlap, right?
Well, I grew up, my dad is a CPA, and he was in finance for lots of different textile companies. So I moved around a lot. I went to 9 different schools before boarding school because he kept changing. And the textile industry in the 80s was being outsourced to China, et cetera. So I would say a couple of learnings from a financial perspective. One, having to start over because he had to start over so many times was interesting. Wow. And he had multiple points when a company went out of business and would get bought or sold. Sometimes he won in those situations and sometimes he didn't. Yeah. So I learned it in that way. And that's kind of a Gen X thing as well. We were the first latchkey kids ever, right? So we were the first people to see parents not have financial stability because defined benefit plans went away and went to 401, all of that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. That's more the sort of family side, I guess. From a personal investing perspective, I got my first checking account when I was 5 because my dad thought it was important and I had a little checkbook. And I think all of that taught me, one, just the importance of having your own stability from a financial perspective. Yeah. Because seeing some instability, my parents always made it work and they're perfectly well set now. But that was, as an only child, also important to learn from.
Yeah. I think that it's easy to look at what is going on in your family and think either I'm going to copy that or I'm going to do something completely different than that. And I think that brings up this point of, why do you think that it is that there are a lot of parents or parental figures out there for individuals who are saying, hey, let's do this with your money, or trying to give this encouragement to younger people or even adults. We're getting this kind of education. Why do you think it is that you decided, I'm going to actually heed my dad's advice, whereas the rest of us usually don't want to listen to our parents?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I always heeded his advice, to be clear.
He would probably disagree, right?
He would probably disagree. Right. I mean, there were many times in his life where he's like, you're terrible with money. What are you doing? Yeah. And for me, actually, money is not my driver in life, which is an important thing. When we can talk about that later in terms of my decisions, but I've wanted fulfillment and purpose from a work perspective. Yeah. And I actually saw that from both my parents. My mom is a nurse. and spent her entire career working with pregnant teenagers in low-income communities. So she never made a lot of money, but that was a purpose choice that she was able to make.
So you just said that you're not motivated necessarily by money. What are you motivated by?
Impact on the world.
Yeah.
I've been lucky enough to have good role models in lots of different spheres, not just my parents. Even when I was in banking, when I started at Merrill, I was the first openly gay financial advisor in 92 years at the firm, and we can talk more about that later. But I want to have enough money to survive and have a good life, but I've seen so many people, especially in the finance world, get trapped, right? Golden handcuffs and create a lifestyle that has to be maintained.
Right.
A mentor of mine once asked me, "What's your number?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, what is the number that you need to have in a bank account to make you feel happy?" And I wasn't able to actually answer the question because there wasn't a number, but I thought about, what do I need in life? Is it all of these pieces? And this is probably 10 years ago. And I was like, wow, I have all those pieces. Like I'm good.
Nice.
Which is a great feeling to be able to have, and everything else is gravy in that way.
I oftentimes think about our community and the financial struggles that a lot of folks in our community find themselves in. And the reality is that there is a ton of advice. There's tons of information out there.
Yeah.
We'll say it's not necessarily always in the flavor or in it being presented by individuals that our community would resonate with. But what do you think is the reason why our community maybe struggles to tap into the knowledge that is available and the tools that are out there?
I think there are lots of layers to that question. I think if you look at it generationally first, which is how I do, those of us in our 40s, the guys that were just ahead of us either died or thought they were going to die.
Right.
Right. So there's this huge generation of people who basically maxed out all their credit cards because they thought they weren't going to be here. And then, thank God, protease inhibitors and all the other pieces came in. And so they survived. And so there's that generation that had to navigate living, and the guilt coming from that, but also the debt that they'd incurred. Then there's our generation who, came into this. I mean, when I started Merrill, like I said, I was the first openly gay financial advisor on Wall Street. No one had spoken to our community about financial planning in 2001. And there were 1,049 rights at a federal level we didn't get because marriage equality wasn't a reality. 90% of them were financial. And, as we built that, now every Wall Street bank has a team, which is great. But that doesn't always resonate. It doesn't always mean that people trust. I don't think you have to have a gay financial advisor, by the way.
Right.
I think straight allies can be phenomenal and amazing, but they do have to be educated. And I do think, finance is a tricky conversation for anybody, not just our community. Like taking it out of ours, I remember we did research that showed that there was research that Merrill did, this is like 2002 or 3, asking the Black community who they wanted in a financial advisor. What was their archetype for what they wanted? And you know what they said? A white guy.
Ooh.
Really?
Yeah. You know why? 92% of them said they wanted a white guy.
Wow.
Why?
Because that's all they saw, probably, right?
That's all they'd seen.
The white guy's going to do me good.
Well, that's all they'd seen, number one. And number two, they thought, okay, who actually controls the world? It's the white guy.
Yeah.
And he knows it's not girls, it's not people in our community. And so one of the things we learned from that was Merrill was trying to hire Black financial advisors to work with the Black community, and they were failing. They couldn't figure out why. And so when they partnered a Black financial advisor and a white financial advisor, it was actually a much more successful situation because the Black community perceived that white men knew how to run the system. They knew how to do all the finance stuff. And while they wanted to support their community, that wasn't, when it's really my money, I want somebody who's going to. So there are all these nuances, not just in our community, about trust and people feeling like they can trust the people that are looking after their money. And unfortunately, I think over the years, there have been lots of reasons not to trust. And so there's this self-reinforcing challenge that I think a lot of organizations have.
What are your thoughts on tapping into I can see somebody thinking to themselves, if you need a financial advisor, we're not in the same tax bracket. So what are your thoughts on how to connect with those who feel like they're at the lower end of the income spectrum, to get them to think about their money financially, their financial security, to get to a point where they would need a financial advisor?
I think the simplest is just coming up with some sort of budget and savings. I mean, you don't need a financial advisor to look at what are my cash inflows and what are my cash outflows. And can I save $20 a month? Can I save $40 a month? And just coming up with some sort of system is really the simplest way, I think. And making it automated, which is super easy to do now. You don't need a financial advisor to do that.
Right.
And building up. And I think that's, whether it's just having enough cushion so that if you get laid off, you have 3 months worth of rent, all the way through to, if you're under a tax bracket, you can do a Roth IRA, right? I mean, little pieces like that, I think are the starting point anyway. I think people get very overwhelmed.
So that was the first part of our awesome interview with Todd. We really appreciate it.
He has some great insights, huh?
Definitely. One of the things I really love is he talked about this idea of we need the knowledge to be able to improve and grow. So we need to find the people that we can actually get that knowledge from. And Sean and I started the Queer Money podcast for our community for that very reason. Back then we were the only ones. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by many others. Folks like Hadassah Damian of Ride Free Fearless Money, Kenny the Trans Capitalist, and Lauren and Jess of Bitches Get Riches, to name just a few.
Exactly. So the idea is to find those you resonate and can connect with, grow and learn from them, watch your financial security grow. And with that, we'll be right back after this message. Welcome back. Coming up in the second part of Todd's interview, he shares how he used a setback and turned it into a setup, which is not something that we're all good at. Are we, David?
I don't know, dear. Maybe we're not.
Maybe
I think what you're
think
getting
about
at-
Margarita Summer?
I think yes, right. So back in 2005, I was also laid off. And at the time I got a 9-month severance check. And instead of using it as a setup like Todd did.
What did you do?
I decided to take the summer off. And I sat by the pool with a friend of mine for 5 months, basically.
And what was the result of that?
I blew through all that 9 months worth of severance. And as a matter of fact, I actually added more to my mountain of credit card debt, making my situation even worse.
So let's see how Todd more wisely and judiciously used his severance package.
Let's head in a slightly different direction here with this whole idea of there's a lot of folks right now who are very scared. I think that the data points from MarketWatch was that 70% of folks are thinking about or preparing for there to be a recession and layoffs coming with that. That's something you have some experience with, right?
Couple times.
Huh?
Right. So let's talk about what was it like for you going through scenarios like that?
Yeah. Well, so out of college, I went into investment banking at a bank called Schroders. Left because of homophobic boss, actually. And my second investment bank was amazing, super supportive, and allowed me to actually connect. I was out on my interview, and that was a big deal. I was like, I'm gay, and you need to know it.
Yeah.
And they were like, dude, totally fine. Chill out. Gay people are great. And that allowed me to start connecting to business in our community from an investment banking perspective. But in 2001, all the debt markets were dead, and it was a small boutique investment bank, and I was one of 2 salaried employees, and they had to lay me off.
Right.
And by the way, it was DeSilva and Phillips. They were the kindest layoff ever. They paid me for 3 months, let me keep my health care until I found a new job. I mean, it was the kindest layoff ever. And I ultimately went to Merrill after that, and we can talk about that sort of journey. That led me to being recruited by Credit Suisse to be head of diversity and inclusion for them, which was a pretty huge role. And 2.5 years in, there was a bit of a political maelstrom internally. And I was called in and said, hey, we're going to take diversity in a different direction, and here's a severance check, and take care.
What was the picture of your financial situation at that time when you got let go? Were you surviving on the severance, or did you have a
First
cushion?
time or the second time?
The second time, before you started out leadership.
Yeah, well, I used my severance check to start out leadership.
Right.
So I had enough savings at that point, and I had restricted stock, and I'd been able to build up. The layoff was a challenge, but I was able to use that severance and build something new. The first layoff was a little bit scarier because I didn't have that kind of a cushion. I had, I think 6 months worth of savings at that point. But their severance plus that was enough to allow me to make it through. And I think that learning also carried through. I never wanted to actually ever be in that position again where I wouldn't, I think at that point I wanted to have a year's worth of cushion without having to tap into retirement.
The reason why so many people have so much anxiety around recessions and around the idea of layoffs is because the vast majority of us are not in a situation where we have 3 or 6 months, let alone maybe even $400 or $500 saved for emergencies. We are literally, I think that the data keeps showing that there's a larger and larger percentage of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck to paycheck, right? And that is, I think that any sort of hiccup, we always hear the markets talk about uncertainty and how uncertainty is scary for the markets, but uncertainty for the individual who's living paycheck to paycheck or only has a couple $100 saved is just as dramatic or traumatic to them.
Yeah, it is. I think there's a broader thing, though, from a life philosophy perspective. Living with anxiety is something that if you can avoid, there's a saying that I love, that the universe is always conspiring for your success. And it's very easy to get caught in that trap of, oh my God, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Well, okay, that's going to happen, but maybe that's happening in 18 months.
Right.
But are you spending the next 18 months being miserable, worrying about it, and then it actually happens?
Yeah.
Right.
Right? Like, life is short. And I feel like there's this whole piece that people miss when they get massively anxious and worked up.
Yeah. So when you decided to launch Out Leadership, which came first, the severance package and the layoff, or were you already toiling in your mind, if I were to do something different, it would be what Out Leadership becomes?
That's a good question. Well, just backing up, I guess. So the beginnings of it were when I was at Merrill and I started this team. And in my interview at Merrill, I literally had to be out in the interview, and I was a little bit scared because the guy interviewing me was an old Southern conservative white guy from the South. And he asked me what was the hardest thing I ever had to do. And
Talk to him.
Yeah, basically, what was like the hardest thing I ever had to do in my life? Yeah, it could have been. Or the most challenging thing I had to deal with. And I thought, well, it was coming out, right? But do I say that in this interview? Or do I say my dog died? And I said, coming out. And he said, pause. And he said, oh, that's interesting. I would have thought that would have been a positive. I was like, oh, cool. You're an ally. So I want to tell you this idea I have to build a team to focus on gay financial planning. But I also made the case that Merrill had to support gay rights. If we were going to do that, we had to have the right policies, et cetera. And so in 2001, they'd never sponsored a gay organization. I brought in $100 million in the first year, and my goal was 12. So I got a meeting with the CEO, and that built almost $2 billion over 5 years. But I got Merrill to change policies and spend almost $3 million supporting gay rights. And that had never happened. And so I had that as a major learning. And a piece of what I did at Credit Suisse was build the first LGBT recruiting program on Wall Street called Open Perspectives that we won a couple of awards for, which was cool. So that was the second piece. If I could actually figure out how gay talent could get supported. So those were sort of the two sort of framing pieces. I had definitely not thought about getting laid off. I didn't think that was going to happen. And I definitely had not thought, oh, I'm going to start my own company and build this. But when I did, I was sitting on my sofa with my severance check and, as I like to say, a Hendrix Martini or 3.
I like Hendrix too.
I mean, it's where the greatest ideas come from. I mean, I feel like, hello, Hendrix, you should be sponsoring Out Leadership. And I thought, well, at that time, CEOs were not speaking about LGBT rights still. Companies had not used their economic power. I mean, I thought, God, if I can get one Irish Catholic company like Merrill to do it, can I get more?
Right.
And that was really the genesis of it. I got 6 bankers together that fall and said, hey, I want to build a summit. And I want it to focus on business, talent, and equality. But in that order, I want companies to understand that there's a business opportunity.
Right.
They have to have the right talent and support our talent, and equality can be the output of that. And that was the start of it. I called it Out on the Street. And we had Bank of America, Barclays, Citi, Deutsche, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and the CEO of Deutsche Bank to host it, which was the idea. It's like a Davos idea. And we grew from there. So I launched in London 13 years ago. In Asia 12 years ago. We were the first LGBT summit ever in Asia. And in Sydney, Australia 9 years ago. So we've had 148 summits on 5 continents since, and engaged over 1,200 CEOs, 180 companies, about 30,000 business leaders, as well as developed talent. So we have a talent program called Out Next, which we're having our 10th annual summit next week. So we have 5,000 young LGBT leaders that have gone through that program all over the world.
Nice.
One for women called Out Women. And one for board leadership called Out Quorum, because from a financial perspective, we were not even included in the definition of board diversity for 498 of the Fortune 500 companies when I started it.
Right.
And now almost a third of them do include us because we wrote the policy for them.
Nice.
So there's a lot of cool stuff that we've been able to do from an Out Leadership perspective. It's the first global LGBT business organization ever. Which is kind of neat.
Absolutely.
With that in mind and the name dropping of the companies that you just did, and folks, today was the day that we learned that, was it today or yesterday? Molson Coors announced that they're backing away from DE&I and pulling out from HRC's not municipal corporate equality index. Last week it was Ford. We're seeing this happen. What are your thoughts on that happening with all of the work that you are doing with Out Leadership?
I actually have some thoughts that are maybe surprising.
Share.
Surprise me.
Surprise us.
Have a sip of your coffee. So when the HRC started the Corporate Equality Index in it was 20 years ago, 18, 19 years ago, Elizabeth Birch was the CEO at the time. Very few companies in the Fortune 500, I think it was 60%, had non-discrimination policies. Now 98% of the companies do, which has been amazing and a direct result of the CEI. and the results that they've gotten from that and the business impact, the market impact, et cetera. Do I think that, by the way, Jack Daniels is a great example, so Coors, but Ford. Jack Daniels has 100% on the corporate equality index right now. That means that they support trans rights, they have trans medical benefits, they've done all the right things.
Right.
Do I actually think they're going to repeal those policies? Do I actually think they're going to start discriminating against LGBT people? Are they going to repeal their non-discrimination policies?
Yeah.
No.
Right.
They're not. They may not report to the corporate equality index any longer, but I'm not sure that's the worst thing.
Yeah.
I'm much more concerned about what they actually do. Right. And so there's this interesting opportunity, I think, that we as a community have to look at DEI broadly. First of all, DEI now has legal risk that did not have 18 months ago. So to force companies to do the same thing that they've done for 30 years, some of which has delivered amazing results, not all of which has, and that's an uncomfortable conversation that people don't like to talk about. But now those policies and those structures have legal risk. The opportunity is to innovate. How do we say, okay, what do we need now?
Yes.
There's a guy named Martin Davidson at UVA Darden School who talks about leveraging difference versus managing diversity. And if you're managing diversity, it's a problem. It's only focused on 6 areas of visible difference. It's only HR driven. It's not connected to business. And it fails because you say, I have too many of this and not enough of that.
Right.
And what's the this? Straight white men. You have too many of them. And the that is women, people of color, LGBT, you name it. And what message does that send? The straight white male doesn't matter.
Right.
And the people you don't have enough of only matter because of immutable characteristic, not their talents.
Right.
Yeah.
Leveraging difference is the exact opposite. It's business focused, opportunity focused. All differences matter and everybody has a part of it. And that actually works.
Yeah.
So I think the opportunity is for us to think differently and innovate.
So do you think then that's going to call on companies to actually be more visible in the way in which they are actually living it, doing it?
My whole philosophy is how do we help companies do better?
Right.
I'm never going to be in the business of calling people out. I want to call people in and bring them along. I'm going to take them where they are and bring them to where we want them to be. And backing companies into a corner and naming and shaming them is not the way to get them to change.
Right.
But helping them see the opportunity of why it matters, because they will do what's in their bottom line sustainable best interest on an ongoing basis. And that's what you want them to do, not just get some award that they can point to.
Right.
Focus on the return on equality.
Yes. Well, we always say, like people say, oh, people do it during Pride Month and it's not real.
Yes.
Right? So in the same way, why would we only say that the CEI? Because you can game any of these things.
Yeah.
Right? Not just the CEI, the working mother list. There are all these lists.
Right.
I mean, policy doesn't equal culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, that's a great way to end this interview because now I don't feel as anxious as I did before you started it.
You shouldn't feel anxious anyway.
But I do want my Hendrix gin. Thank you so much for coming in, Todd. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Of course. That was a really great interview with Todd, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I love how he shared that even sometimes the worst experiences can turn into amazing opportunities.
Are you judging me?
David, I would never do such a thing. Never. But I think how this applies to people's real lives today is that there's a lot of talk today about a possible recession. And of course, with recession, oftentimes come layoffs and people start getting anxious about losing their job. So David, why don't you share 3 recommendations as punishment for your margarita summer for what people can do if they're concerned about losing their job?
All right. Well, the first thing is make sure that you understand what your company's severance policy is. You can find that through your HR department. The second thing is remember that severance check is going to have a big chunk of taxes taken out of it. So make sure you have a spending plan for that smaller amount. And the third piece is find some way to come up with some sort of backup income plan, whether that's taking your side gig to a full-time thing or maybe starting a side gig. Find a way to generate some income during that time when you don't have a job.
Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay fabulous.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.